Bore da pawb. Hello everybody. Welcome back to My Wild Welsh Garden if you're a regular viewer, and special warm welcome, croeso cynnes iawn, to any new viewers. Well, my name's Isabel and I live here at the top of the Swansea Valley, and this is my garden which I am wilding or rewilding. I'm turning it from a conventional garden into a wild garden. And I'm back from my adventure of last week when I went to England and I visited the wild garden. No, they don't call it a wild garden, they call it a rewilded garden at Knepp. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Knepp, it's a 3,500 acre estate in the south of England. And it's been there for hundreds of years, and it's been farmed for last century, as a intensive arable and dairy farm, I think it was. And the current owners inherited it in the 80s and tried to continue farming it in the same way, but they couldn't make it profitable. So at the end of the 90s, they stopped and decided to rewild it, and since then the wildlife has returned and it's become really quite famous as a fabulous place to go and see very rare wildlife like the turtle dove and the nightingale, which is on the verge of extinction in the rest of the UK, but at Knepp the numbers are increasing. And as well as the wider estate, they have two walled gardens. Well, in Victorian and Edwardian times, that would have been where they grew the fruit and vegetables and the cut flowers for the house. Well, 5 years ago, one was the smaller one was a kitchen garden, but the other one was just a croquet lawn. And they decided, I should say their names, shouldn't I? Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree. They decided that this wasn't really in keeping with the rest of the estate, and they decided that they would make a garden built on rewilding principles. So they would use what they had learned from the wider rewilding project and try and garden in that way in the garden. And so that's what they did. The difference between what happens at Knepp and what happens in other sort of conservation projects, nature reserves, that kind of thing, is that in Knepp they've sort of set processes in motion rather than trying to conserve and keep a situation as it is. And they do this with what they call keystone species, and these are the big herbivores. So at Knepp they've got Old English Longhorn cattle, they've got Tamworth pigs, they've got Exmoor ponies, they've got red deer, and I think fallow deer and sort of the smaller ones, rabbits, have come in of their own accord. And what these animals do is they affect the environment, and they all affect them in different ways. They sort of trample the ground, and they dig up the ground, and they compact the ground, and they affect the vegetation. They graze and they browse, and they all graze and browse and dig up and all the rest of it in different ways. And this causes a very complex environment, and it can change from year to year. But everything that they do creates habitat for other creatures, other plants and other animals to move in and colonise, and that's what's happened. Well, I didn't see any horses or any deer. I did see some cattle, but only at a distance. But I did come across these two young pigs that were busy rootling the ground, and you can see the mess they make. You can see how deep the holes are and how they disturb the ground and leave it ready for other plants and animals to move in and colonise. So they started making the garden in 2019. So it's quite a young garden. And this year they've started to offer sort of what they call garden safaris or garden tours, and also workshops about sort of designing, maintaining a rewilded garden. And so I chose to go on one called Managing the Rewilded Garden, because those of you who've been following me for a while will know that this is what I'm struggling with. I'm finding that the transition from a conventional gardener to a wild gardener is really quite difficult, especially when you're nearly 70 and you've been a conventional gardener all your life. So yeah, I was hoping that I would learn some stuff and I would bring back some ideas and be able to implement them in my garden. And this video is really sharing with you what I've learned, and maybe you can implement some of the stuff in your garden as well. But I do have to say, before I sort of show you what the garden, that I only actually had an hour in there. It was a long way to go for an hour. We had a talk from one of the deputy head gardeners, which kind of took up half the time really. So I only had an hour, and yeah, I was trying to see everything and film everything and listen to everything that Moy was saying, and it just didn't work. And it probably comes over in the video, but there was something to learn, and I do hope there's something for you to learn as well. So the first thing that they did was they landscaped the garden, and they did this by dumping quite a lot of building rubble just on top of the croquet lawn. And they made sort of humps and bumps and hills and valleys. So lots of different sort of aspects, some sheltered, some sunny. So different kind of conditions that would suit different plants and different animals. And the idea here is to just create as much biodiversity as possible. Well, I was looking at my garden, and of course, it's mostly just flat, south facing on a slight slope. There's no humps and bumps. There's no sort of areas that face in other directions other than south. So I was sort of looking around and seeing if I could see anywhere that I could maybe make a hump and a bump. And I have said before that I do want to do something about the part of my garden that I call the orchard, because it really I've had some apples this year and I have some soft fruit, but they really don't like it there. They're not doing very well at all. And I thought, well, maybe I could do a hump and a bump there. So that might be my winter project for this year. And then they planted all these plants. There are thousands of plants from about 900 different species, I think. Now, they're not native by any means, not all of them. I don't know what they all were. I didn't get a chance to ask. There was a plant list in where we met to have our talk, but yeah, there just wasn't time to study it in any detail. But you can see that there's plenty of non-native grasses here. The plants have all been chosen for their sustainability and their ability to self-seed. And given the number of plants that were still flowering in the middle of October, I think they're probably chosen as well to have something in flower pretty well all year. plants that were the star of the show for me were the asters. There were some lovely asters, and they all had bumblebees on them, and it was the middle of October. And also displaying their ability to self-seed. Well, I have got an aster in my garden, which is pretty well over by now, but it's fabulous for insects when it's in flower. So yeah, note to self, buy more asters for next year. And this is a lovely plant that caught my eye, but unfortunately I can't tell you what it is. It just looked very pretty. And there were some hardy geraniums still flowering, and it kind of reminded me of my garden, because I have a lot of hardy geraniums. And the geranium Roseanne that features in so many of my videos is still flowering. Don't know there are any bees on it today, but I came out on Wednesday when it was sunny, and yeah, there were several bees on it. And because it was the middle of October when I was there were quite a lot of plants that had gone over, and quite a few dead plants. Well, conventionally, you take the dead plants out, but they don't do that at Knepp. They just leave them there, or for habitat for different creatures. They may remove them, but then they hang them somewhere. So here on a wall, and here in a tree. So the habitat remains, it's just sort of relocated, but it can still be used by any creatures that want to use it to hide in or overwinter in. And I thought, well, I've kind of started doing that in my garden. I'd already bundled up the stems of the Angelica plant that kind of went over and fell over. I bundled those up and tied them in a dead tree that I'd planted. There was a fennel at the front of my house that was gradually sort of falling over onto the pavement. So I cut that down and bundled the stems up and hung those up as well. So I think I'm going to do that. Any plants that are beginning to fall down, and sort of particularly the ones that fall onto the path, I'm going to cut down and bundle up and hang in this tree. So now we come on to the controversial subject of weeds and weeding. And those of you who've been following me will know that this is something that I've struggled with, how much weeding to do. Well, in fact, they don't have weeds at Knepp. They have volunteer plants that have arrived of their own accord. And they don't call it weeding, they call it grazing. And what the gardeners try and do is to behave like the keystone species in the wider rewilding project. So these animals all eat the foliage in different ways. So cows sort of pull plants up, horses and deer sort of nibble them off at ground level, and pigs dig the plants up. And so the gardeners do all those sort of different things. And the other thing that animals do is they move through an area. They don't sort of eat everything to the same level at once. They'll have a nibble there and a nibble there, and they'll take some plants out. And so that's what the gardeners have tried to do. And the herbivores that graze the wider estate are selective. So they don't eat all the plants uniformly. They select out the plants that they want to eat, and I guess it's based on how nice they taste. Well, the gardeners at Knepp select the plants that they want to graze as well, but they use different criteria. Things like how beneficial they are to wildlife. Are they a larval food plant, and do they produce seeds for the birds? How easy they are to remove, and how sort of invasive they are. And this enables them to give a sort of grazing level to the plants, and helps them decide how much of these volunteer plants they want to take out and how much they want to leave. And I found this really helpful, because I have some volunteer plants that are coming of their own accord into my garden, more than I want, really. So I'm going to designate these a high grazing level. These are the wild strawberry and the little willow herb. It's not the rosebay willow herb, it's a small one. Yeah, so I'm going to be a wild herbivore, and I'm going to find them very tasty, and I'm going to graze as much away as I can, and I'm sure there'll still be enough for any wildlife that wants them. So another way that the wild herbivores affect the vegetation is by browsing, and this is the equivalent to what we gardeners call pruning. And just like the grazing, the browsing doesn't take place to the same amount at the same time. The herbivores sort of wander through a thicket and, have a munch here and a munch there and a munch somewhere else, and then, maybe come back next week or next month and have another munch. And so that's partly what they try and do at Knepp. But the other thing is that herbivores can only eat what they can reach. And so the gardeners are trying to kind of mimic that by the way that they're managing the climbers on the walls of the garden. Well, this is a climbing rose, and what they've done here is that they've pruned it in the middle at sort of herbivore munching height, which means that the flowers are all at sort of human eye height, but they've left the tops nice and wild and bushy as habitat for all sorts of creatures and potential nesting sites for birds. And they've done something similar with this honeysuckle, except the stems in the middle got very untidy, so they've sort of bundled them up into 3 kind of bundles to tidy them up. So it's about being sort of creative, really, and thinking of new and different ways of managing your plants that conventionally it just isn't done. And I think I'd already tried to do this a little bit with my rambling rosy here and the honeysuckle next to it, because I haven't pruned the tops. I've sort of let the tops get nice and shaggy and wild, and pruned the stems more. So yeah, similar sort of effect. I'm quite pleased with that. I was particularly interested in seeing the kitchen garden. The Rewilded garden was made from scratch, and it's a very young garden. But the kitchen garden was here already and has been sort of converted to a wild garden from a conventional kitchen garden. So I was particularly interested to see about how many volunteer plants they had, and yeah, there were certainly a lot of volunteer plants in the vegetable beds, and there was more evidence of actual grazing going on in the kitchen garden. But I was also really interested to see how their fruit and vegetables were coping with all the pests that must be attracted into the garden if they're gardening in a wild way. And yeah, their spinach and their chard looked fine and lovely, but yeah, what can I say? Some of their brassicas looked almost as bad as mine. And I did notice that they grow their soft fruit in a fruit cage. And I was very impressed by the way they prune the yews in the kitchen garden, which I guess have been there for a while. Well, yew is usually clipped into smooth, elegant shapes, columns and cones, to add structure to a garden. But because they're uniform, the kind of habitat that they provide is very uniform. Whereas these yews have been pruned as if a wandering herbivore had wandered into the kitchen garden. So there you have it, pretty much what I learned from my managing the Rewilded garden workshop that I went to at Knepp. As I say, it wasn't long enough, and so there's probably all sorts of stuff that I've missed out and got wrong and only got half right. But I hope there's enough there to sort of whet your appetite, really. There's all sorts of resources if you're interested in knowing more. Isabella Tree wrote a book about the whole process of rewilding the estate called Wilding, and I do highly recommend that you read it because it really did change my life. There's also a film of the same name. It was on general release, but you can get it on YouTube now. It does cost a little bit, but not very much. There's not so much about the garden because it is very young, but there's a video of Bunny Guinness, who visited earlier this year, and she's in conversation with Isabella Tree. And there's also a podcast by Sarah Raven in conversation with Charlie Harper, who's the head gardener at the Rewilded Garden. So yeah, lots of things to read or look at if you're interested. So thanks very much for visiting me again in my Wild Welsh Garden. If you're interested in following me on my rewilding journey, then please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye! Hwyl fawr!